So everybody online should be able to hear me, and we're getting started with our last and absolutely not least lecture series talking about leadership, Arctic leadership. And we're just really lucky to have, and I'm grateful to have two individuals who I think of as just exceptional leaders in terms of scholarship and academia, but also in terms of their approach to the Arctic and the peoples of the Arctic. And so I'm going to read each biography brief biographies, and then we'll begin with Dr. Terry Chapin. So Dr. Chapin, known to his friends as Terry, which I'm delighted to know that since I call you Terry, you think of me as a friend, and that's fantastic. So he is an Alaska ecologist who has written textbooks in ecosystem stewardship, ecosystem ecology, and plant physiological ecology. And based on this stewardship work, for which, right, he was awarded the 2019 Volvo Environment Prize. Did that come with a car?
No.
No. Okay. But still, Volvo, right? Environmental prize. He wrote Grassroots Stewardship, Sustainability Within Our Reach, to explore stewardship with a general audience. This book represents a positive and pragmatic strategy by which individual citizens can shape a more sustainable future for nature and society. Chapin's research addresses the effects of changes in climate and wildfire on Alaskan ecology and rural communities. He explores ways that communities and agencies can increase the sustainability of ecosystems and human communities over the long term, despite rapid climatic and social changes. In this way, society, we the people, right, can proactively shape changes toward a more sustainable future. He pursues this internationally through the Resilience Alliance, nationally through the Ecological Society of America, and in Alaska through partnerships with rural indigenous communities. And I can absolutely testify that Dr. Chapin talks the talk and walks the walk. And another person who does this, right, will be our second distinguished speaker. And this is Dr. Oran Young, who's a professor emeritus at the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at the University of California, Santa Barbara. His research focuses on theoretical issues relating to the roles social institutions play as elements of governance systems, with applications to the atmosphere, the oceans, and the polar regions, right? All of these places where change is happening rapidly. He also does comparative research on environmental governance processes in China and the United States. And Dr. Young, you have such a long and distinguished CV. I'm just going to pull a few highlights, right? So he served for 6 years as the founding chair of the Committee on the Human Dimensions of Global Environmental Change for the U.S. Academy of Sciences. He chaired the Scientific Steering Committee of the International Project Institutional Dimensions of Global Environmental Change. And I was lucky enough to participate with Dr. Young and the team in this for a little while. So beyond this, there's such a long list. I want to point out just a couple things. He is the recipient of the 2018 International Arctic Science Committee Arctic Medal and the 2024 Mohn Prize for Outstanding Research Relating to the Arctic. Like Dr. Chapin, he has published books and articles and is a mentor to many, many people. So thank you both for being here and online for these two distinguished speakers. Dr. Chapin, if you'd like to come to the front, we will begin with you.
Thank you very much, Amy.
You're welcome.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you folks about leadership tonight because it's a topic that I hadn't really thought much about. And so it gave me a chance to think about it. I've always admired effective leaders of causes and organizations that I believe in. They often articulate the opportunities and give us the inspiration to move forward on issues that we all care about. However, I have to confess that leadership doesn't come naturally to me. I'm a relatively shy person and don't feel comfortable pushing myself forward. In addition, I seldom think of the right thing to say when somebody asks me a question or asks me to discuss an issue, I don't think of the right thing to say until the next day. So I don't feel like I'm very good at in showing leadership on the stage. I doubt that I ever did anything resembling leadership when I was growing up, either in terms of interactions with my friends or when I went to high school or college. So instead, I sort of chose my own path, and I learned from other people and from things that I did. However, the one watershed moment for me was when I joined the Peace Corps after college. My job was to teach biology to high school teachers and education majors in Bogota, Colombia. And I had to learn to do this in Spanish. So a teacher is by definition a leader. So I had to learn to be a leader just in order to maintain the respect of my students. If I didn't do that, it would have been just chaos. So in that sense, I did learn something about leadership. But the way I chose to do this was largely by the Socratic method of asking questions and engaging in a conversation with the students in order to help them learn how to think about issues, to understand how things worked. And so it seemed like a much better way to approach things than by trying to present them with information. After all, one of the goals of the Peace Corps was to encourage democracy, which requires thinking. And it had been an educational system there that was dominated by memorization of facts and figures. And I wanted to see if I could encourage these students to do a little bit of their own thinking about how things worked. So this is still my approach to leadership. I'd much rather be involved in collaborations, working with other people, than in trying to take any sort of top-down approach to leadership. For example, the Bonanza Creek LTER project was one of these groups that I directed, but I didn't really direct it. We had a team, we had a leadership team, and every important issue was something that we discussed, and we generally came to consensus, and then we figured out how to move forward. And it was the same thing with the resilience and adaptation program that Amy and I were both involved with. I never felt that I played a leadership role there. It was more a question of working to figure out how to do things. And at the beginning of this program, we didn't have a clue what we were talking about with respect to resilience and adaptation, but we worked through it, often with a substantial amount of help from the students. But this definitely required conversations and wasn't the sort of thing that any one of us could have directed in a top-down fashion. And it's been the same, it was the same way when I was president of the Ecological Society. It wasn't an issue of a question of directing something. First of all, I didn't want to even run for that position until I had some notion of something that I wanted to accomplish that through this, an intellectual objective. And my main objective was to move beyond ecology for ecologists and begin thinking about ecology for society and society for ecologists, and think about the interconnections between ecology and social issues. And that was something that some people in the Ecological Society were somewhat skeptical of, because they felt that society should be something to serve ecologists. And so in starting to move along these lines, the first thing I did was to have a lot of discussions with the student section of the ESA. And some of the people who were skeptical of this idea said, these students need to learn ecology before they go out and spread their wings into broader sets of issues. I wondered if that was really true. So I asked them about it. And the general response I got was, no, we came here because we care about the connection of ecology with society. That's why we went into this field. We want to do something that will make a difference. We would feel deprived if we didn't have a chance to think about these connections. And it's these sorts of conversations that come up when you begin to ask other people their opinions about how things should go is, I think, just one of the really wonderful opportunities of being able to be in a position to be part of these discussions. Well, I do think that leadership in Alaska and the Arctic is special in many ways. It's a unique opportunity because the issues in Alaska are so broad and there's so many important issues and there's such a breadth of disciplines that are absolutely essential to really make good progress in moving towards a sustainable future. But it's also a place where there's relatively few scientists compared to the breadth of topics and the importance of the work. And so I always felt that the first thing I needed to do was to learn from people in other disciplines about their perspective on Arctic change. And so it was the same kind of thing of beginning with collaborations and conversations rather than coming in with an agenda that I wanted to use for leadership. And so I felt that I was usually in the mode of learning about other disciplines, learning about aspects of my discipline that I wasn't entirely familiar with, rather than having a set of knowledge that I could convey to other people. And this idea of collaboration and mutual learning is something that I think has always been useful to me. Now, I did spend a year at Berkeley, and I spent a decade at Berkeley, and it wasn't nearly as easy a place to have this sort of a collaborative approach to leadership. It was much more, there were many more scientists there, and so it was a much more crowded intellectual space. And there was more of an attitude of competition, as well as trying to find the best thing, the most effective things that people could do as individuals in their discipline. But I've always felt lucky to be living and working in a relatively non-competitive environment such as Alaska. It's a place where it's really easy to have conversations with a whole range of different kinds of people. So in this sense, perhaps this approach to working with people in my discipline and other disciplines has sort of led me away from leadership within a discipline. And I feel much more comfortable in bridging than in seeking to deepen my understanding of a particular area of science. And I think I got started out in this way in my PhD. I wanted to do something that I thought was important and novel, but and so I had been working, my advisor was a plant physiological ecologist, and I began working on the adaptations of Arctic plants to be able to thrive in Arctic conditions. And specifically, I worked on the absorption of nutrients from cold, infertile soils. And that was an interesting topic, and I learned a lot about it. But perhaps the most interesting thing I learned was that when I really tried to relate the acquisition of nutrients by Arctic plants and their growth rates, I realized that it wasn't the physiological capacity of the roots that determined their growth rate. Instead, it was the breakdown of dead organic matter to produce nutrients in the rooting zone that really controlled the rate at which plants acquired nutrients. So I couldn't answer the big question I wanted to ask about what controls the growth and success of Arctic plants without taking a somewhat broader approach and thinking about ecosystem ecology. So I shifted from physiological ecology to ecosystem ecology. And this is, in this sense, the directions that I've taken through my career is mainly a result of things that happened to me rather than any sort of pre-planned notion of where I wanted to go. And so next I became more aware of the tremendous human impacts on ecosystems and through both direct impacts and changes in climate. And so I realized that just studying ecosystem ecology and plants was not enough. I need to move towards a social ecological approach and think about how nature and society interacted so that I could understand the dynamics of either ecosystems or society or the two of them interacting together. And then I became interested in the notion of stewardship, which is not just learning about how these things work, but thinking about how you can shape the future of the interactions between nature and society so that both can thrive. And that's what I've been doing for a bunch of years now. So now that I've retired, I've taken another shift. I've decided that I don't want to do science anymore as a major focus. It's still one of my favorite hobbies, but it's not my major focus. Instead of trying to put my efforts into gaining new knowledge, I would prefer to emphasize the utility of what we know from science in addressing social and sociological problems. So society is certainly faced with accelerating challenges. So thinking about how to do this has been intriguing to me, and something where again, I'm very much in the learning phase rather than in having a set of subject matter in which I feel that I have the expertise to really provide leadership in that area. But I'll leave it to Oran to talk about many of the social science issues on the societal connections with environment. But I wanted to give you a couple of examples of things that I found interesting. I think one of the things I've done over the last 2 or 3 years is to work with the Fairbanks Borough to develop a climate action and adaptation plan. And initially, well, Alaska in general and Fairbanks in particular has always been a purple state where there's a very thin margin between progressive and conservative political perspectives. And so I think it was in 2021, the borough had a slight progressive majority, and the borough passed a resolution to ask to hire a contractor and appoint a committee to develop a science adaptation and action plan. And they asked for volunteers, and I volunteered for that, as did many other people. And almost all of us that were involved in this climate action committee were people who are really concerned about climate change. And we had very compatible perspectives on how to go about this. And the contractor that they hired also had a very similar perspective. So it was easy for us to work with them. They were the ones that actually wrote the plan, and we simply provided feedback to that. And this was fine. We got through all of the background chapters, and we're just getting ready to launch into the actual meat of the plan, which is the goals and recommendations. And at this point, there was another borough election, and the Conservatives took the majority. And the new head of the assembly dismissed the entire committee and appointed a different one that had a very conservative focus. It included several people that outright didn't believe in climate change or thought that climate was an ideological issue rather than a scientific or a societal issue. And one of the members of this new conservative group resigned because he realized he didn't have the time to do it. And for some reason, they asked me to join that committee. So I did. So it was really interesting to be in a situation of people who were very much opposed to the work that the earlier committee had done and to the drafting of goals and recommendations that had been done by the contractor. And Another new experience. So this was a new experience for me. Another new experience was that every conversation we had to be done by Robert's Rules of Order, which I'd never heard of, much less knew how to navigate. So I've spent the first couple of meetings just trying to figure out how to say anything in an environment of this sort. It was definitely, I was on a very steep learning curve. And one of the things that the chair of this committee asked us each to do was to go through the entire plan as it had been outlined by the contractor, go through each goal and recommendation, and decide what you thought it should say. And so so then we had this long list of recommendations and the perspective of each committee member on how this should be reworded or whether it should be tossed out completely. And this was really helpful to me because I could see the perspectives of each person. And I very quickly realized that it wouldn't do me any good to try to present the perspective of the previous committee about climate change to this group of people. In the few initial conversations we had, it was clear that they weren't receptive to that at all. So I carefully read through each person's goals and recommended actions. And the thing I gradually began to realize is that there was substantial agreement about the outcomes. We all wanted to save energy, and there was substantial agreement about the broad goals. We wanted Fairbanks to be a community that thrived. But it was the motivations that connected the goals to the outcomes that were ideologically different. And so what I ended up trying to do is to look at the various wording that other members of this committee had proposed and to use primarily the wording of other people as long as it led to the outcomes that I subscribe to and that hopefully that the various other more conservative people subscribe to. And then be able to tap into multiple motivations. So for example, for energy use, everybody wanted to reduce energy use. I wanted to reduce it to reduce the impacts on climate. Other people wanted to reduce it to reduce costs and save on taxes. And so it was usually the motivation that was different. And so I found that we could have a civil conversation if we could agree to allow more than one motivation to lead to an outcome that we agreed would be desirable. Now, this didn't always work. There were some recommendations that came from the contractor that they didn't want at all. They just tossed them out. And one vote against 6 or 7 others, I didn't carry much weight in that. So in the end, we came up together with something that had a substantial degree of agreement with both the original desired outcomes and the more conservative desired outcomes, not always, but something close to it. And that also met the original goals, but that had multiple motivations. I found that one member of the committee in particular often had wording that I could live with. So I often I often suggested that we use that person's wording as a starting point for each goal and recommendation. And that sort of diffused my role as a rabble rouser. And so I found that it was really useful in thinking about talking across big political divides to really focus on developing trust, showing that I respected other people's perspective on things and was willing to go along with those. And so eventually we came up with a plan. It was still pretty ragged because there hadn't been time to do a really careful job of fine tuning the plan. But so after the whole thing was finalized and presented to the assembly, I decided to go. I asked the chair of the assembly if she minded if I would just go through the plan and suggest ways in which both motivations, conservative and liberal, could be highlighted as important parts of the plan, but that we would have a cohesive set of recommendations in terms of actions and goals. And so I gave that to her, and she modified it as a result of conversations that she had with various people in all sides of the political spectrum. And then that was finally passed. The version of the plan that our second conservative committee produced was unanimously rejected by the assembly. Half of the assembly didn't want any climate plan at all. And the other half of the assembly, the more progressive members, didn't appreciate the way this second committee had trashed what they thought were the important contributions of the earlier representation of the plan. So this was, I thought, was a very useful lesson to me as a way to move forward in a time when there's not agreement. Now, there's a book that I've really come to appreciate, written by Wondalek and Yaffe in 2000. It's called Making Collaboration Work. And the interesting thing that they suggest is that the really important thing for collaboration is not necessarily that two parties agree with each other, but that if they are in conflict, that both of them need the other one in order to move ahead. So in the Applegate watershed, for example, there was a loggerhead controversy between conservationists and loggers. Neither one accepted the other, but they needed to have a logging-based economy, and they needed to have a forest that would last into the future. So they came. Eventually, what happened is that they found that they could, with the skill of a facilitator, they could come together. And at first, all they were able to do was sit in the same room without yelling at one another. And then they got to the point where they said, okay, let's have another meeting. And gradually they came up with a management plan that met the needs of both of them. And they still are able to manage this forest through sustainable forestry that includes both logging and conservation. Am I overrunning my time, Amy?
I think so.
Okay.
Maybe,
I'll wind it up.
10 minutes.
Okay. So in giving you this description of my meandering pathways through science, I don't think I've really given you any great insights about leadership. So I thought what I'd end with is just some things that have been personally useful to me in trying to figure out how I could best contribute to science, not in the sense of trying to be a leader, but just how can I work and function in this sort of thing. So I realized that I always start out by choosing topics that are interesting to me and that can be done in a place where I would enjoy working. So working in Alaska was just a delight because I love doing field work in Alaska, and there were lots of things that I found intellectually exciting. And some of these were things that I could see a potentially broader impact. So for example, when I started out working on absorption of nutrients by plant roots, I realized that from infertile soils, I realized that a globally more important issue is how does agriculture work in producing food on soils that never have enough nutrients to meet plant needs. So there are some potentially practical issues that are embedded in that. As it turned out, I didn't continue working on plant nutrition so much as moving on to ecosystem stuff. And the second thing that was useful to me is that I realized I preferred collaboration with other people rather than telling people what to do. That just wasn't my style, and I didn't know how to do that effectively. And as I told you, I learned this mainly by learning how to teach in the Peace Corps. And then later I've worked on various projects, as I described, where it's really been led by a collaborative team rather than by a single person that provided leadership. I've always been interested in the mechanisms of how things work. And that was true in terms of the mechanisms by which plants absorb nutrients, the mechanisms by which microbes, plants, and animals interact in ecosystems, and the mechanisms by which society and nature interact. And most recently, the mechanisms by which you can try to find constructive conversations in what seems to be a toxic environment. And I also usually found that the initial questions I had were really naive, and that I had to broaden my scope if I was going to really make much progress. So this is how I went from physiological ecology to social ecological ecosystems to stewardship. And finally, I think one thing I've increasingly come to realize that I need to regularly remind myself to focus on what's important to me rather than getting swept up into what other people think I should be doing. And so right now, so what I do is keep a list of things, projects, or ideas that are important to me and that I want to pursue, and think about the time scale over which I address those. And right now, the thing that's on the top of my list is to contact as many people as I can to get them to raise the visibility of the SAVE Act, which is intended to restrict voter registration and voter access to the polls. I think that's incredibly important in these days of chaos. There's lots of parts of chaos, but that's my top issue right now. So I don't know that I've really contributed to leadership ever, but if I have, it's probably been inadvertently as a way of trying to do the science that I enjoy, and having fun, having conversations with other people, and trying to find something useful that might come out of it. So I'm not sure I've given you good suggestions of how to pursue leadership, but I hope I've offered you some stories and suggestions of how you can find your own approach to leadership, because it's going to be different for all of us. Thank you. So now I'll leave it to Oran to take the next step.
Excellent. Well, it's a real pleasure to talk after Terry. I always find that I learn a lot when I listen to him. I think you'll find as my comments go on that he and I have followed very different pathways. But I hope you'll find there's actually quite a lot of similarity in our perspectives, both in terms of our approach to leadership, our sense of styles of leadership, and also in terms of our long-standing interests in the kind of intersection and the relationship between biophysical systems and human or social systems. So what seems very different actually, I think, has quite a lot of similarity. In the next minutes, I'd like to organize my comments into, I think, about 5 different sets of observations. And in the process, I'll try to respond to the questions you, the organizers, presented to me, and hopefully give you some insights about leadership along the way. So the first set of observations have to do with setting my trajectory. I was a graduate student at Yale in the 1960s during the Cuban Missile Crisis and at the time of the assassination of President Kennedy. these were turbulent times, to say the least. Of course, we live in chaotic times today. But we felt in those times in the 1960s that these were times of great turbulence. Possibly reflecting these experiences, I wrote a doctoral dissertation focusing on possible roles for mediators in mediation in severe international conflict. So after I finished my PhD, I took a job at Princeton. This was just at the time that the Vietnam conflict was escalating. And so together with several of my Princeton colleagues, I wrote a book entitled Neutralization in World Politics, in which we were exploring possible regimes that might be useful in settling or at least managing the Vietnam conflict. So these early experiences were formative in shaping the thinking that has guided my efforts ever since. In several ways. One is that I have a long-standing interest in finding ways to resolve or manage conflicts rather than pursuing individual goals. When Terry was talking about teamwork and collaboration, I was thinking that resonates very strongly with me. I'm much more interested in finding common ground than in playing the role of advocacy on behalf of a particular interest group. I'm also interested in creating effective institutional arrangements, or what we now call governance systems, to address specific problems. And I'm intrigued by the links between analysis and praxis. I come, of course, fundamentally from the world of analysis, but I've always been interested in thinking about under what conditions can analysts make contributions to addressing real world problems. All of those have been characteristic of my approach to issues, my leadership style, if you like, from those early days to the present. Then a second set of comments about coming into the Arctic. I came to the Arctic in the 1970s by way of Alaska. I had my theoretical interests in collective action problems, bargaining, especially the role of social institutions, but I realized that an emerging focus of public interest and attention was the environment and environmental issues. This was a time when the environment was emerging as an issue of national and even international significance at the time of the first Earth Day and so on. And so I thought I had an opportunity to spend time in Alaska. Maybe I can join these things together, my theoretical interests and a concern about these emerging issues involving environmental questions and problems. And just at this time, there were a number of really significant institutional changes that were occurring. For example, coastal states like the United States were extending their jurisdiction to much larger areas of marine systems. In 1976, the US Congress passed the Fishery Conservation and Management Act, setting forth a new system of governance for marine areas under US jurisdiction. There was, some of you may recall, growing interest in Alaska in what we came to think of as limited entry fisheries. And so I tried to join together my theoretical interest with a focus and a real in-depth concern about these emerging institutional changes and the challenges they presented. And I learned right away that in order to say anything interesting, I would have to really learn a lot about the biophysical systems that were the focus of my interest. And this led to a series of publications. One was called Resource Management at the International Level, focusing on options for regimes or governance systems for the Bering Sea region. Another was a long paper called Fishing by Permit, looking at the ins and outs of limited entry fisheries. Another was called Resource Regimes, trying to kind of generalize this interest to governance in relationship to natural resources and environmental issues. And two things about leadership that came out of this that are of lasting uh, prominence in my thinking. One is that I discovered the virtues of linking a focus on issues of theoretical interest and current issues of concern to policymakers. So I had a theoretical interest in the formation and effectiveness of social institutions to meet needs for governance, but policymakers were concerned about creating regimes to create changing conditions in marine fisheries. And I realized that if you focused on issues where you could connect these theoretical and practical issues together, you could often come up with really interesting and relevant insights that were useful not only to theory, but were useful in the public discussion of the day. But secondly, and along the way, I was drawn into, was evolved into the international Arctic community. The international Arctic community is a transnational network of people who share a commitment to the well-being of the Arctic and its peoples and who interact with each other largely in their personal capacities. And becoming more and more engaged in this Arctic community is something that has become a very important part of my professional and personal life, even from that day to this. And then a third set of comments, I call it thinking in circumpolar terms. As we moved into the 1980s, those of us in the international Arctic community began to think in circumpolar terms. We began to entertain ideas about the role of the Arctic in a post-Cold War setting. Already in 1985, I published an article on what I called The Age of the Arctic in a prominent journal called Foreign Policy. And of course, President Gorbachev's speech in Murmansk in October 1987 energized this line of thinking and made it a prominent kind of focus of international attention. And fortunately, just at this moment, actually in this same week that Gorbachev gave his speech, I received a large grant to launch what we call the Working Group on Arctic International Relations. The focus of the Working Group was to bring together a combination of analysts and practitioners to engage in a series of off-the-record brainstorming sessions to flesh out a way of thinking about the Arctic and to build relations of trust on a personal basis. So during 1988 through 1991, we focused in the working group on fleshing out what has often been called the Arctic Zone of Peace narrative, and to treat that as an exercise in what policy analysts call agenda formation. That is, identifying emerging issues, framing them for consideration on policy agendas, and moving them toward the front burner in terms of the attention of the policy community. And so we began to talk about the Arctic as a distinct region with a policy agenda of its own. The Arctic as a region of particular interest to what became known as the Arctic states. We observed that there were no serious conflicts rooted in the Arctic itself. And we thought that this provided an opportunity to reset East-West relations in the post-Cold War world. And that led to a focus in the coming years on the creation of bodies like the Arctic Environmental Protection Strategy and the Arctic Council. And over the years following this, I stayed involved in the Arctic community. I chaired the first International Conference on Arctic Research Planning in 1995. I consulted happily and I think very productively with a group called the Standing Committee of Parliamentarians of the Arctic region. I co-chaired the Arctic Human Development Report. I was a leader in launching the University of the Arctic. I was the first chair of the university's Board of Governors. I chaired the Arctic Governance Project. And so I was very much in this kind of environment of trying to engage still in scientific work, but work that would connect to issues of current interest. And so a fourth set of comments, I call it assessing where we are now and addressing current challenges. Conditions in the Arctic have obviously changed dramatically from what they were in the 1980s to 1990s. The Arctic is tightly coupled to global political and biophysical systems. There's no going back to the narrative that guided us during the 1990s and the 2000s. Arctic issues are much more contentious than they were in the 1990s. But still, I would argue that all is not lost. And so two things have become very much central to my thinking in these times. One is to ask the question, can we articulate a new narrative to replace the narrative of the 1990s and the 2000s to guide intergovernmental relations regarding Arctic issues in the 2020s and 2030s? My goal is to identify alternative ways of framing the Arctic agenda that help us to avoid simplistic geopolitical perspectives that saturate many popular accounts of Arctic issues today, being realistic, but avoiding the securitization narrative. And secondly, has led me to ask the question, what opportunities are there in the realm of non-governmental actions? What are the opportunities for social organizations above the individual, but below the state? And I very much focused on what I think are the roles, and I would say the social responsibility of the international Arctic community in a time when intergovernmental initiatives are difficult. And quite frankly, in this country, when civil society is increasingly severely threatened. And so I'd like to talk a lot about the role of the non-governmental actions. What can the international Arctic community do in these times? And finally, let me just wrap up with a brief set of comments on what I call advising future Arctic leaders. And here I have three things that I want to leave you with as thoughts. The first one is think about different types of leadership. Many people think about leadership as what you might call demonstrative leadership, as getting out in front and advocating some new path and being the person who's leading the pack. I think an extremely important alternative is what I called at the outset of these comments, enabling leadership. And I think it's very much related to some of the things that Terry said. Enabling leadership is not how you can draw attention to yourself, it's how you can contribute to helping different groups, sometimes conflicting groups, to find common ground or help to galvanize collections of people to become effective teams to be able to collectively make things happen. And so that notion of, I think of it as an enabling leadership, to me is a really important focus of attention, and I hope other people will follow that lead as well. The second point follows from the last set of remarks I was making, is to differentiate between leadership at the intergovernmental level and leadership at the non-governmental level. So I've been quite active in both of these realms. I think they are both extremely important. I think it was highly important what we were able to do that led in the 1990s to things like the Arctic Environmental Protection Strategy, the Arctic Council, intergovernmental actions. But I also think that leadership at the non-governmental level, leadership in civil society, is highly important. And quite frankly, in times like these, when we are experiencing a leadership deficit at the intergovernmental level, I think non-governmental leadership is absolutely essential. And third, I think it's very important to differentiate leadership appropriate to different phases of what we in the political science world call the policy cycle. Leadership in the context of agenda formation is one thing, but leadership that's at the early stage of the policy cycle, leadership at other stages is quite a different thing. So leadership, when it comes to things like vetting, assessing the strengths and weaknesses of different policy options to address a particular issue, is another thing. Leadership, when it comes to evaluating performance, is yet another thing. So I would advise people who are thinking about leadership to pay a lot of attention to where their interest in leadership fits with respect to what we think of as the different stages in the policy cycle. So I don't know whether this has answered the questions that you posed at the outset, but these are some of my observations from the last 50 plus years of work on these issues. And I will close by simply saying I'm not done yet. And I still feel energized to continue to work on these questions, because I think this role of leadership, these various roles of leadership, could not be more important, and certainly could not be more important in these times. Thanks.
Thank you.
Questions in the room? Taryn? Yep.
All right. Good evening, and thank you both for joining us tonight. My name is Taryn Kristen. I'm an undergrad in the Arctic Northern Studies program. I'm also kind of dabbling in marine science as well as ecology, so it's like extra awesome to talk to both of you. My question for you actually leans more towards the science side than the leadership side. We're seeing a lot of newer terminology floating around like as the Arctic changes, and one that's caught my attention is this whole new Arctic thing. For me, I feel like calling these changes that we're seeing new Arctic and just slapping a new label on it kind of softens the blow for the damage that we're actually causing to the polar regions. I think that we have set definitions for how we describe the poles and the environments there. And once these areas no longer fit those descriptions anymore, can we still even call it the Arctic? So what is your opinion about this new Arctic terminology? And are you in favor of calling something the new Arctic, or are you more on the side of once it's gone, it's gone?
Of the Arctic as much as it was a description of a new programmatic emphasis. So I think of the Arctic as something that is always in flux. And the changes are certainly more directional now than they were before. But that doesn't, I'm not sure that has much to do with the programmatic definitions that were put in place. Oran, what are your thoughts about the new Arctic as a framing of today's issues that's been put forward by NSF and other groups?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, well, let me be a little bit provocative. I don't think the new Arctic is a very helpful term. I do think that it's very relevant to observe that we are now needing to think about the Arctic in the context of a dramatically changing, perhaps a new global order, both with respect to political and economic issues and with respect to biophysical issues. But the drivers of these quite dramatic changes are not coming from the Arctic, they're coming from a much larger kind of global setting. And so these global changes are, of course, having very significant consequences, impacts for the Arctic, but it's not because it's a new Arctic.
I would agree.
Hi, Oran. Hi, Terry. Really grateful for all of your words and your presentation today. This is Nicholas Parlato. I have worked with Oran, one of your co-authors and colleagues, Paul Berkman, and I was kind of grilling him at this event that we were at together. In terms of, what does a sustainability transition entail? And he expressed, under a little bit of duress, the idea that sustainability and a global kind of transition towards kind of more just relations is not compatible with the Westphalian nation-state system. And so for both of you, kind of thinking about the institutions and policies and governance that are currently, the options that are available to deal with climatic change and massive ecological disruption, as well as social conflict. And also as students of history, do these scales at which things like the United States or Russia or China, at which they operate as a container for policies and institutions, are those compatible kind of with a future that is more sustainable? Or do the broad structures that we're dealing with have to change in other more fundamental ways?
Well, perhaps I can respond to Nicholas. Hello, good to hear your voice. And I see you're being provocative as usual. But briefly, here's my response. The terminology of sustainability and sustainable development has become very diffuse. I'm not sure how helpful it is at this stage, but I feel very strongly that we, as a species, now face a collection of challenges which will be difficult and perhaps impossible to address effectively within the framework of the existing global political and economic order. These include climate change, but they include other things like the spread of infectious diseases and dealing with digital technologies, and particularly artificial intelligence, and dealing with biotechnology. I think that we are going to face a profound challenge, and perhaps sooner rather than later, in trying to adjust or to reconfigure our institutional arrangements on a global scale in ways that are more effective to address these kinds of challenges or face extremely costly consequences. Now, how can that transition take place? Well, that would be the subject of a lecture or perhaps a course. And so I can't answer that right here, but I've written fairly extensively on the subject and would be happy to share citations.
Okay, we'll go to a few online questions now. So the first one comes from Hannah. I'm assuming this one's for both of you. So her question is, how do NGOs formats, NGO formats of leadership help form Arctic policy? Can you describe how NGOs are different from governmental organizational efforts to create change in the Arctic?
I think that's another one for Oran.
I was thinking before Oran gives the more organizational NGO approach, Terry, maybe you could share with us some of the work that you have done, because it goes to the last question as well, within the rural communities of Alaska. So I'm thinking of when those rural communities as organizations, right, know what they're facing, and they're not these big nations, right? They're not full of politicians and massive budgets and governments. Is there some thread that you have found as they work towards sustainability that speaks to both of these questions?
Well, perhaps they are certainly have a very strong cultural and spiritual approach to thinking about how they relate to their environment. They have to adjust to massive changes day to day, month to month, just in the annual cycle. They're always adjusting. And many of these changes this is just part of what they do. So I think they're fairly comfortable in the notion that things have changed, they will change, and they have sort of a touchstone from culture that gives them a way of thinking about how to move forward. And it's certainly not well incorporated into national structures of planning and how to do things. I certainly have a lot of respect for the way they manage the land and sea locally, but how that works across areas is more challenged. There's certain areas like the International Whaling Eskimo Whaling Commission that have been very effective in working across countries as they learn from one another about the changes in whale populations and how those are affected or not affected by recent hunting, as opposed to hunting at in the whaling days.
Right. So that would represent for us then that local scale of organizational capacity and adaptation. And then maybe we then turn to you, Oran, to go more into Hannah's question about these NGOs and the organizations, right? They're not replicating the stewardship that we see from indigenous small communities. So how do you see them as actors in this period of change? The larger ones, right, at that national scale and international scale.
Let me respond to that, Amy. But first, let me just pick up on what Terry was saying about these local communities and cultures. It's not just that they have cultural sensitivities, which they do have, but they actually have ways of knowing, ways of learning, ways of coming to understand systems and the dynamics of complex systems. In short, they have a kind of knowledge which is different, rather different in character from what we think of as kind of mainstream Western knowledge. And I think we're coming slowly to understand that, and that we need in these times to benefit and to take into account multiple forms of knowledge and ways of knowing, and that we need to find ways to recognize, encourage, acknowledge, and make use of these other forms of knowledge rather than saying, oh, well, it's not Western science. But now to Hannah's question. I think there's different kinds of NGOs. Some kinds of NGOs are straightforward advocacy organizations. And they have an agenda, and their purpose is to engage in policy processes at every level and in every form that they can to advance their agendas. I don't have a quarrel with that, but that's very different from other kinds of non-governmental organizations, and I would say the non-governmental community as a whole, which is interested in not just narrow self-interest, but is interested in larger issues. For example, like Terry's concern for stewardship, and are contributing by helping us to develop the concepts and the way of thinking and the discourse that can help us to, for example, frame issues, bring them to the attention of people in the policy community. I think that organizations and communities of that kind who are not just thinking about their next move to push their particular agenda, but are thinking about how to contribute to the development of a larger discourse can, and I think have, played an extremely important role in the Arctic over the last 40 years, no question about it.
Well, thank you so much, Oran, and thank you, Terry, for participating in our lecture series.